I don't think Donald Trump, when he wakes up in the morning, knows what he's going to do at bedtime. I see malignancy more than madness. Trump has filled his inner circle with weirdos and suspect people.
David Frum is a writer at The Atlantic and a former special assistant and speechwriter to George W. Bush when he was president. He also worked with J.D. Vance. Vance wrote for a website that Frum ran from 2009 to 2012 called frumforum.com. And he joins me now. David Frum, welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for being with us. Look, you wrote recently in The Atlantic about the opioid dispensers who operate around Donald Trump. Can you explain what those are?
Well, human beings do not want to live in a random universe indifferent to our fate, indifferent to our feelings. We construct systems of belief and meaning to explain sinister events. So when a malign person seizes control of the government of the United States and begins acting in destructive ways, there's a tremendous craving for an explanation of some higher rationality or logic. And because of this craving, there's a tremendous market for people who satisfy that craving and say, look, it looks like he just punched the baby for no reason at all, except that he likes punching babies. But actually, the baby punching is in service of countering the Chinese state. And you're not supposed to think very hard. Well, how does punching a baby help us counter the Chinese state? But the point is, you're promised that it will. And there are a number of people, I don't name them in the article, but I describe their role and function. And I think, like the Lord High Executioner and the Mikado, you can fill in the names yourselves. There's a lot of this going on with the tariffs, with the betrayal of Ukraine, with the abandonment of Europe. There are people who are anxious, eager to provide anxious, eager for meaning, and people who will provide that meaning.
People who are basically keen to say there are reasons behind this. The reason why he's behaving as he does over Ukraine is to boost European defense spending. The reason why he wants to make peace with Russia is to strengthen himself in the forthcoming fight against China. The reason why he wants tariffs against Canada is to stop drug smuggling. And you basically think all these things are nonsense.
It's not that I think they're so obviously nonsense. Once you start working out, it isn't up to me. It's not a matter of opinion. If you were to ask the person who gives you the rationality, explain to me how this would work, the system of rationalization collapses so instantly. And let's take, for example, betrayal of Ukraine to strengthen America's hand in the Pacific. So the Prime Minister of Japan came to Congress and gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, in which the Prime Minister of Japan, one of America's very most important allies in the Pacific, said the defense of Ukraine is essential to the defense of Japan. So he's a liar. The argument goes like this. The United States has a limited supply of credibility. If it uses any of that supply of credibility in Ukraine, that will make less credibility available for other ends. Now, the problem here is, first, it's like paying your debts, that you don't say, I want to impress the mortgage company, and therefore I'll default on the electric bill. That way I'll have more money to pay the mortgage company. The mortgage company wants to know that you pay your bills. But the next problem is Trump has repeatedly said during the campaign, twice, once in an interview with Bloomberg, once with some right-wing website, that he would abandon Taiwan. And since becoming president, he's been more circumspect, but he's hinted pretty broadly that he might abandon Taiwan. So every signal to the Chinese is an invitation. And finally, Trump is building his own presidential fortune, quite shockingly, by selling meme coins to Chinese investors. And in one of these deals, a pardon for someone who's now in prison, or pardon who was in prison, is now an out-of-prison felon, is part of the deal. So no one in China is going to take seriously that Trump is trying to contain them. What they can see instead is that he's smashing up the alliance system that is the only hope to contain China.
Do you see any method in the madness, or do you just see madness?
I see malignancy more than madness. I don't think the president is literally crazy. I mean, he believes a lot of things that are not true. But my late father, in the days of handwritten cafe bills in Europe, would always minutely examine the handwritten cafe bill, and he said, if they were just bad at math, you would expect half the mistakes to be in my favor.
Okay.
So
yeah.
So I don't think Trump is delusional in many ways, but the delusions are always in favor of Putin, in favor of anti-democratic establishments. And let's take the point where it's sometimes said that Trump is attacking the Europeans to get the Europeans to spend more on defense. So why is it that the countries he most mistrusts are those that are doing just what he says? That his co-president, Elon Musk, personally abused the Polish foreign minister and then the whole state of Poland, which has the highest and most robust defense program in Europe. And what is the party in Europe they relentlessly champion? Is the Alternative for Germany, which is a party that opposes increases in defense spending. This is not about more defense spending to counter Russia. This is about not countering Russia.
I mean, it's certainly true that Trump's been much more demanding of Ukraine than he has of Russia and Vladimir Putin. What do you think of the idea that his strategy, despite all that, is more likely to bring about peace than Joe Biden's strategy, who was sort of more than content, delighted to sustain the war?
There are many criticisms to make of Biden's strategy. Biden was a very cautious president, and so his policy was find out what Ukraine needs, give them half. And that saved Ukraine at the beginning, but it made it difficult for Ukraine to bring the war to a successful termination. I think it's true. When Trump said, I can bring peace in 24 hours, that's true. But peace on what terms? That his plan always has been to cut off Ukraine, abandon it, and give it essentially to Russia. And what Russia, if you remember that, keep in mind that what Russia seeks here is not some territory. Russia is not short of acreage. It doesn't need any acreage at Ukraine's expense. What it wants is to ensure that the government of Ukraine is subject to Russian will, as it was before 2014. That's the goal. And Trump's willing to give them that goal. And for example, that's why he has made the resignation of Zelensky one of his demands, that if you can force Ukraine to rewrite its government at Russian demands, then you've given the Russians the things they really want, which is control over Ukrainian sovereignty. So yes, Trump can bring so-called peace, but on whose terms and with what damage to Ukraine, to Europe, to the United States?
You were part of the speechwriting team that came up with the phrase axis of evil, famously used by George W. Bush to describe Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Do you think Donald Trump has an axis of evil in mind? And if so, who is in it? Is Europe in it?
I think Canada, Europe, Japan, democracy, honest financial regulation, his ex-wives,
it's a big axis.
His daughter by his second wife. I think they would be in the axis of evil for Donald Trump.
What do you think he thinks links all these things? Are they simply people, bodies, individuals, countries who are opposed to what he feels he wants to do? Or is there something more, whether he properly recognizes it himself, is there something more philosophical behind that?
What Trump has been doing domestically in the past few weeks has been a series of major initiatives of intentional illegality. He tests the limits. So, for example, he said, all these budget cuts you're hearing about, the president, these are all funds appropriated by Congress. The president does not have the legal power. Once Congress has appropriated money, the president has broad discretion to administer the money, but he can't refuse to spend money that Congress has appropriated. When he cuts the voice of America, that's illegal. Trump just this past weekend defied a court order about the deportation of accused, not even accused because there hasn't been any process, but of presumed Venezuelan gangsters. He defied a court order. So Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress authority over spending. Trump has challenged that, has ignored that. Article 2 puts the courts in charge of supervising the legality of executive acts. Trump has just defied that. So that's Article 3. Article 2, I beg your pardon, is the presidential power. And he's just this weekend tweeted out that he's not going to respect the pardons granted by his predecessor. So systematically, one by one, whenever you show him a legal limit, he says, right, let me test that. Because what he wants is unbounded scope for will. That is inconsistent with any legal system, any system of rule of law, and especially with the American system of rule of law.
Okay. Look, I want to ask you in a minute whether you think the Republican Party is coming back. But before that, I want to ask you whether it's perhaps more severe than that, whether you think America is coming back. Has America fundamentally changed this last month? And has it changed for good? Is the America that the world used to rely on, is that gone?
Look, not to get all existentialist on you, but life is action. Life is decision. So I don't think we achieve anything useful by standing back from the scene, stroking our chin, puffing on the gauloise, and uttering some meditation about what America is. The point is, democracy is a very radical idea, always has been. It's constantly undermined by enemies and opponents. And we are in one of those times of testing now. And so I don't think any of us should be looking outward and saying what's going to happen. We should be looking inward, asking what will we do if we don't, as citizens, respond to these attacks on the legal structure, on alliances. Then yeah, things will be very, very bad. But if we do, the residual strength of the democratic idea is also very powerful. So let's do that. Let's not comment. Let's act.
The America of the past, the America certainly of your time in the White House was strongly interventionist. You were often called the neoconservative. This is before you ended up voting Democrat because of your opposition to Trump. But do you think Trump's isolationism, if we can call it that, is that in any way?
Call it that.
Why shouldn't we call it that?
One of Trump and his vice president and co-president have often talked about the value of American unilateral military action inside Mexico, whether Mexico agrees or not. Trump wants to has been paying illegally, I think, money to El Salvador to warehouse people whom the United States does not want. He's building this kind of international prison system. So these are not isolationist acts, nor is the interventionist versus non-interventionist distinction very meaningful. Again, think of what Trump is proposing in Mexico. Trump and his vice president have repeatedly called on European nations to rewrite their domestic laws in favor of his cronies, especially Elon Musk. That's not non-interventionist. The idea that an American vice president would go to the Munich Security Conference and say, I have some ideas about which party should be in the German governing coalition and which should not. That's not non-interventionist.
That's a long way from non-interventionist. Yeah.
I think your taboos against inviting neo-Nazis into the government, I think that time, the time for that is past. And I say, as the American vice president, bring them in to the coalition. Oh, and bring in the pro-Russian people on the left too. That was his message. Bring in the pro-Russian people on far right and far left. You're not supposed to have opinions about those things. This is not a non-interventionist government, and it's not an isolationist government. It is a predatory government.
Well, so that's interesting. That notion of it being predatory, is that the difference here? Then, rather than America intervening in the world for the sake of what? For the sake of humanity, for the sake of democracy, for the sake of stability. Yeah. Now, the idea, at least in Trump's mind, is that America intervenes in the sake of the world, in the rest of the world, for the sake of America alone.
The way American leadership since World War II has thought about matters is, take the Greenland story that you hear so much about. So Greenland, home to 80,000 people, is a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, which is not a military factor. If the United States wanted to seize Greenland, it easily could. And if it wanted to suppress the 80,000 people of Greenland, if they attempted an insurgency, we're talking mad projects here, but the United States could do all those things. So why does it not? Well, the answer is because American presidents since 1945 have understood that America's supreme interest is a system of non-aggression. The United States fought the three major wars the United States fought between the end of World War II and the end of the 20th century were all in defense of boundaries. Fought a war in Korea against the North Korean invasion of the South, fought a war in Vietnam against the North Vietnamese invasion of the South, and fought a war in Kuwait against the Iraqi attempt to abolish the Kuwaiti state. And these states weren't all great states. South Vietnam, even Kuwait, have a lot of, they're not exactly democracies, but the United States said, invasions across international borders are so dangerous. The project of abolishing states altogether is so dangerous, we will even use military power to stop it. That's our interest. And so the idea of picking up some frozen acreage in Greenland, a country which is a member of the EU and a member of NATO, Greenland is a territory, I should say, member of EU, member of NATO. If you want to open a mine, there is a legal structure where mining can be done. If you want to increase the 200 American personnel in Greenland today to 400, the Danes would surely say yes. They've often asked for more in the past. Every legitimate interest of the United States could be served through cooperation. But for Trump, the predation is the end. And that is a new chapter because, as I say, we fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Kuwait to say no predation.
Let's turn now then to the Republican Party, the one that you knew and were a part of. Has that gone? Is that coming back? Can it recover?
Well, it's very hard to start new political parties in the United States, so and easier to change them than to replace them. So probably the Republican Party, something called that, will exist for a long time. But it has certainly reoriented its policies. This past weekend, we have had the Secretary of the Treasury all over the airwaves defending high tariffs, defending higher consumer good costs, defending intervention in markets in a way that would have been unthinkable for a Republican of 20, 30, 40 years ago. So the party's changed. The Republican Party is now a much more statist party than it used to be, a much more protectionist party than it used to be, a much less respect for the Constitution and rule of law party than it used to be. And that's why I don't feel at home there anymore.
That brings us on, I think, quite neatly to J.D. Vance. You worked with him. Explain what he was like back then.
So I knew him as when he was a quite young man. He had returned from his service in Iraq. He was, I think, on his way to Yale Law School. And in those days, I ran a website that was about the reform of the Republican Party that offered a platform to young writers. We didn't pay much, so the writers were young, to talk about these kinds of ideas. And he was someone who found his way to me. And he was an extraordinarily impressive person, intelligent, knowledgeable, obviously ambitious, and obviously going places. So he published about a dozen articles on my site under a pseudonym, which not uncommon because a lot of people who wrote for me were congressional staffers saying things their bosses wouldn't like. And when they published under a pseudonym, I always honored that. So time went by. We remained in contact after he went on to greater things. He began writing for the Atlantic, where I also worked. And we had contact and communication about his political ambitions. But I never talked about his work for me until he ran for the Senate. And then he commissioned something called self-opposition research. When you're running, what you do is, your opponents are going to be digging into your past. So you dig into your own past and say, where am I vulnerable? So the firm he commissioned said, one of your vulnerabilities is that you wrote so often for David Frum's site, because at that point we had moved very far apart and I was quite alienated from the Trump Republican Party. And so this might be a problem for you. The self-oppo was done by a super PAC, not by the J.D. Vance campaign. And super PACs are not supposed to directly communicate with the campaign. So before this moment of separation, the super PAC and the campaign had struck an arrangement where anytime the super PAC had anything it wanted the campaign to see, it would place it in a certain corner of the internet where the campaign would know to look. The problem for the super PAC was Politico magazine also knew to look there. And so Politico magazine found the self-oppo and wrote a story about this connection between Vance and me, at which point I felt free to talk about it. He had revealed the story. I had not. I kept my promise. The Vance of those days was someone who's very much on the wavelength that I was traveling toward, more economic modernization, toward a more culturally modern Republican Party, to one that was less paranoid and fearful, less accusatory, and more willing to accept the normal turnabouts of democratic politics. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Since then, of course, he's moved in a very radical direction. I don't think with someone like Vance, it makes sense to say, well, was he sincere then or is he sincere now? I think he is the person he needs to be. But I think he's also very driven by short-term imperatives. And so the person he is right now is someone who is very pleasing to Donald Trump, very pleasing to the radical fringe of the Republican Party. I don't know that this is the place you want to be if you run for president, but he may imagine that if he ever does run for president, he can reinvent himself one more time.
Do you foresee him running for president? I mean, certainly.
I didn't foresee specifically that, but I did foresee a big political future for him, for sure.
But I mean, looking forward from now, one would assume there will be another MAGA candidate on the assumption that Donald Trump is not the candidate next time. Do you think it's likely to be him?
I think MAGA is a personality-driven movement, a radical movement, and a movement that does not respect legality. So if Donald Trump is still alive, I would not assume that he would respect the limit on 3 terms. He doesn't respect any other limits. Why would you respect that one? And he may try to keep it in the family dynasty and promote one of his sons. As I say, this is not a political party as normally organized. I mean, Donald Trump can lead this party in all kinds of strange directions. If Donald Trump had chosen to be pro-Ukraine, MAGA would have been pro-Ukraine. When Donald Trump chooses to be anti-Canada for no obvious reason, MAGA becomes anti-Canada. It's not something that has a kind of inner ideological logic. It's more a leader principle party.
Do you think, are there limits to the extent to which J.D. Vance would cheerlead Trump, agree with Trump. Is there any value or steel or backbone there that you could see driving a wedge between him and Trump?
Well, I think if Donald Trump made good on his threat to literally personally shoot somebody in Fifth Avenue in front of witnesses.
That's the bar, is it?
I don't think he'd go along with that. I doubt it. I can't be sure, but I don't think so.
Wow. Okay. I mean, the JD Vance we saw in that infamous Oval Office showdown with Vladimir Zelensky, was that the guy you felt you knew?
Well, that person was tactical and strategic in a way that Donald Trump has never been. So Vance, Trump has a medley of motives for being anti-Ukraine. He's pro-Russian for whatever reason that is, and Zelensky also didn't fall in with Trump's wills in 2019, and Trump got impeached because Zelensky resisted Trump's demand that Zelensky manufacture dirt against Joe Biden for the benefit of Trump's 2020 campaign. So there are a lot of personal grievances. But Trump is not really a consistent or ideological person. Vance is. Vance is not so much pro-Russian in the way that Trump is, where there's a personal bond between Trump and Putin. I don't think there's a personal bond between Vance and Putin. Instead, Vance is part of a larger transatlantic far right that sees the Russian state as an example of what they're trying to build in their own countries. So he is as attached to Viktor Orban, as attached to the Alternative for Germany, as attached to the parties of the far right elsewhere in Europe and the UK. And what he was trying to do was, Vance also understood that the Republicans in the Senate still mostly support Ukraine and want to be on side and want to be helpful, even as they fear Trump. So he was trying to create a contradiction where you had to be either for Zelensky or for Trump. He was trying to intensify that. And whereas most of the Republican senators are trying to smooth it and say, I'm for Trump and for Zelensky, Vance was trying to create a personal conflict, which is the kind of conflict Trump never can forgive, in front of the TV cameras, which makes it, again, even more powerful for Trump. And then turn to the Republican senators and say, see, it's choose. It's Zelensky or Trump. There's no middle ground. There's no way to support both.
That makes it sound like he knows exactly what he's doing, Vance, in a way that Trump certainly doesn't.
I don't think Donald Trump, when he wakes up in the morning, knows what he's going to do at bedtime. But I think Vance is working backwards from 2028 and has got a list of things to do every minute between now and 2028. As I say, I don't know that he will be the next Republican nominee. I don't know that there will be any other nominee than Donald Trump, but he has to assume that, and he's working backward. He's got a plan, and he's executing it.
Last time Trump was president, if we can remember back that far, there were enough people within the party to moderate him, to rein him in. Sometimes it seemed, both his ideas and his actions and the things he was going to say. And sometimes you could even see him retreat as he was sort of pulled back by people within his orbit. It seems like all of those people have been turfed out of not only the administration now, but also the Republican Party. Is there anyone left from his own side who's going to push back on anything Donald Trump says or does?
Well, Trump has filled his inner circle with weirdos and suspect people. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, Dan Bongino Kash Patel is the head of the FBI. Dan Bongino, who's a former MMA fighter and podcast host with anger management issues. I personally experienced that. Who's now the deputy head. Those people like that should be nowhere near positions of responsibility in any well-ordered state. On the other hand, there are also people like Marco Rubio and Treasury Secretary Bessent who seem like more or less normal people. But the difference in term one and term two is how that the seemingly normal people do appear to have been chosen for weakness of character. In Trump's first term, there were people in the economic wing of the administration would say, you know what, we not only do we believe trade wars to be destructive and wrong, but we're going to say so. And we're going to exert some weight, and we're going to mobilize people to stop you. Now he's got his Secretary of Commerce and his Secretary of the Treasury supporting the tariffs and making wild and reckless promises. The Secretary of Commerce, who's kind of a loudmouth, but no fool, had a successful business career, is on TV saying that we can replace the income tax with revenue from tariffs. Even as we also use tariffs, we spend that, which is first mathematically impossible. But second, also, since the tariffs are supposed to do all 8 other magical things at the same time, they can't both be a source of revenue and a way to do all the other 8 magical things, like get rid of everyone else's tariffs.
Yeah. But look, finally, before I let you go, I'm interested to know where you think this leaves the UK. First, in terms of what our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, can do, because with his idea of being a bridge between the United States and, I guess, the rest of the world,
Yeah.
but also in terms of what it can do to our sort of more right wing politics here, because even our supposed answer to MAGA, Reform UK, seems wary of going as far as Donald Trump. And we have the Conservatives who are not willing to even go that far. So I'm interested, just as you look across the Atlantic, what do you see happening here?
Well, I backed off a little bit when you asked me to make predictions about the future. But if I were a British citizen, I would be thinking you do have to believe that with 2 Trump terms, the American security guarantee is not a certainty. It's something that might go wrong. And so Britain, with European partners, needs to have a security structure to defend itself against Russia and maybe against China, and not just conventional military attack, but cyber warfare, corruption, and other kinds of threats to security. You need to work much more closely with your European partners. So this is not a time to be a bridge. This is, which is the position the British, I think, usually like to be in. This is a time to say the partnership with France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Ukraine, that is the supreme paramount thing that must be fortified. All these countries need to increase their military commitment, but it's not just enough to buy the machines, and not just enough to even to recruit or even conscript, as some countries are talking about, the men. You need coordinating structures. Europe needs a single navy, which it needs a single air force. It needs a command structure. It needs a national security council. It needs a coordinated response for nuclear weapons. Not that nuclear weapons are very useful in the modern world, but they're the ultimate guarantee, and you have to have a way to control them. You need a satellite system so that you're not dependent on American information. We saw that Ukraine discovered that information can be turned off. The technical capacity is there, the resources are there, the human beings are there, but the collective action problem has to be solved. And Europe should be buying, and there should be a combined European procurement agency where, the United States can laugh off Portugal saying, maybe we won't buy F-35s. But if there were an integrated EU-UK Air Force with an integrated EU-UK purchasing structure, if that entity decided not to buy F-35s, Americans would have to pay attention.
But in a European context, that would be revolutionary, and is particularly unlikely at the moment, with the countries generally drifting apart rather than closer together.
You live in revolutionary times, so you need revolutionary actions. And when something must be done, there has to be a way to find a way to do it.
Yeah. David Frum, thank you very much indeed for your time.